Hello, I'm Darren Hughes. It's great to be with you and to talk about volunteer programs today. I think that volunteer programs are a critical aspect of any event, and what we're going to be talking about can apply all the way from an Olympic Games volunteer program down to a community, athletics event or any other kinds of event. And so hopefully what you gain from this session will be really useful principles that you can use in any volunteer program that you're going to be putting together in your events. Okay, let's spend the next little while talking about event volunteers then. So the goal of this presentation or this discussion is to try to help you get the most out of your event volunteers and helping you organize and motivate and importantly create long-lasting relationships as you organize events on an ongoing basis. Specifically, over the next little while, we'll spend some time providing you an overview of the volunteer workforce, although many of you may be well practiced in how to manage volunteers. Let's look at the key processes and tasks in the volunteer journey, and then hopefully we can share some ideas about motivating and sustaining people through a very intense period like an event. So just a little bit about myself. I'm Darren Hughes, and I'm the People Management Advisor for the IOC. People Management is just the umbrella term for all workforce-related activities, including volunteers and staff and contractors that put on the games. And I've had the great pleasure to work with a number of Olympic Games, including the upcoming Games in Tokyo, and going all the way back to 2002 in the Salt Lake Games, which were my first games where I was the Human Resources Director. I've also been fortunate to work with a number of different events outside of the Olympic Games, all the way from World Athletics Championships to Pan American Games, Commonwealth Games, and all other kinds of fun things. So let's dig in. First, we're going to have a quick look at a video just to kick things off. And this is just to give you a sense of how volunteers fit into an event, regardless of the level. So it may be something that's down at the community level or all the way up to elite sport.
Volunteering is for everyone.
I thought I'm going out there.
What's happening?
Nothing.
Why not?
Oh, there's no volunteers.
What now?
I don't know.
There he is. It's the ref.
On your marks.
Oh, hi, Matt. What would you like?
Set.
So, as you will have seen from that video we just looked at, which is a humorous way of showing the impacts of volunteers, the volunteer programs for an event can really have a lot of different aspects to them. They are an important piece of engagement with the local community. They have an economic impact both to the event and to the local community. They bring quality to the event. It's an opportunity to showcase the people of your host city, your host community, and it's a way to achieve some event legacies. So let's look at those in a little bit more depth quickly. First, we always see volunteers as one of the best ways for people from the host community or from your sport to get involved with an event. So, it runs the whole continuum of engagement. People might watch your event on TV, or maybe they'll buy a ticket or come as a spectator to the event. And then, progressively, the better ways to get involved, to get engaged, is to participate in the actual event, whether that be as part of an event, workforce member, as a volunteer, or, maybe in the ceremony. But, obviously, there's a very, very small group of people who qualify as athletes and who are actually able to be in the competition. So basically, being a volunteer is one of the easiest and most engaging ways to get involved. Next, and I'm sure you're feeling this, most events really have to operate on a very limited budget. And so volunteers are a really great solution to reducing your hosting costs and to make the event feasible. So just as a very high level example, in the Rio 2016 games, they did an economic analysis of what it would cost and what would the cost be if they brought all paid staff and replaced all of the volunteers, the 37,000 volunteers working for the games, with regular paid roles. And they saw that is well over $100 million in costs or value, I should say, by bringing that volunteer workforce to the games and having them support the games. And that was a really significant impact. Of course, at a local championships or nationals level, that's obviously going to be a different impact, but still it makes events feasible where they may not be feasible in other cases. And you may have, if you have a loyal following of volunteers that work in your community or otherwise, they may also bring economic impacts to your local community if they come and stay from out of town, or if they come and generate revenue, or their families come. So there may be some sort of indirect opportunities there. Next, in terms of the quality of the workforce that you have, by accessing volunteers, you have a much, much higher chance of getting really talented, engaged, highly motivated people that you would otherwise not be able to get access to. If we were trying to hire those people just directly from the labor market, you probably wouldn't find that kind of quality available for just short-term roles at what would normally be possibly, lower pay levels. And so this is an opportunity to really get in and get the best people. And you see that in many, many events, people with advanced degrees, people with, a lot of time and a lot of experience that are getting involved as volunteers and can really help support your events in many different ways that, again, you wouldn't get access to otherwise. And typically then they are motivated in different ways than just pay. And we'll be talking about that a fair bit here in a minute. Volunteers are definitely what we call the face of the games in the Olympic Games. And for any event, they are really a visible aspect of the competition. They are ambassadors of the local community, the host community, and they are able to really deliver services to your clients or to your athletes, or even just to spectators in a really visible way, in a really impactful way. So they are really important from that perspective. And then, depending on how you dress them up, they may actually reflect the brand of the event, and they can help create that spirit of joy around the event. Volunteers also present a real legacy opportunity. It's a chance to bring people from the community together to create new friendships and long-term relationships. Obviously, there are a lot of benefits to having volunteers involved in your sport and getting them, engaged for the long term. And it also creates a legacy possibly around, sport participation or sport development. And you're also able to provide skills and work experience to a large number of people in the community. And that's actually bringing the overall, skill levels of the labor market up as well. And hopefully you're also developing a long-term base of volunteers to make future event hosting easier and, even more powerful. Okay, so volunteers, while they bring a whole lot to an event, they also brings, it's a challenging environment in which to get people to come and volunteers sometime, particularly when you're not working with the brand of the Olympic Games or, another really high level world championships, but if you're just working more at the community level. The volunteers are not free. So that's one thing that we have to start off with, is that a lot of times you think the volunteers truly are free, but you still may have some costs associated with that. Even if you're doing, sort of really grassroots level recruitment, you may have some recruitment costs. You may need technology depending on the number of people that you're going to be using in your events. You may have costs to create the tools or bring the tools to support you in that. You may provide assistance with things like transport or meals. You may want to outfit everybody so that it's clear that they're a member of your team. And then you may spend some money around, motivating people and engaging them. So if you use an Olympic Games example, we often say that the cost of a volunteer is around, between $1,000 and $1,500 to basically cover all those things. In a smaller event like the World Athletics Championship, that number might be $300 or $400, but still there may be costs associated with that. So even though, again, we have volunteers, there is at least a little bit of an investment that you need to make in order to get that return from them. Volunteers often come with very high expectations. I know in some environments in which I've been able to work, volunteers sometimes come to you with a little bit of a sense of entitlement. They're saying, hey, I've raised my hand, I want to be part of this event. I'm volunteering, so why would you say no to me? Or why would you, put parameters around my participation? So that's something that you often have to deal with. Additionally, volunteers from your public partners or your other organizations that might be involved, it may be a big priority for them to do a good job with volunteers and to promote volunteerism. So it can be a significant element of of politics or public engagement, and you may have then therefore some high expectations around that. Sometimes with volunteers, again, because they're giving up their time and they're sacrificing that, there can be a lot of scrutiny around how you engage and how you work with them. So sometimes there's not a lot of room to make big mistakes. Sometimes it's a more forgiving environment, depending on where you're working in your own host city culture. But sometimes you also have to make some early decisions around the volunteer program and how you'll engage people before you know all those impacts, before you know exactly how the event will roll out. But that's okay. I think that as long as you start working on the motivations of volunteers, which we'll talk about in a moment, and design a program that supports that, then you'll be able to get through that no problem. The volunteer journey is quite complex. There could be a number of steps that you need to go through to bring your volunteer workforce through to event time and through and sustain them through the event. And in a larger event like a World Championships or an Olympic Games or a Commonwealth Games, there's a very similar approach which you see in front of you that most volunteer programs will take everybody through. And even at the a more local event level, you'll still end up doing most of these steps in this volunteer journey and supporting volunteers through it, even if you maybe aren't dedicating a lot of resources to them directly. And we'll go through some of these just to have a sense of that. When you look at the volunteer program, there are a few significant risks that if the volunteer program fails, then could obviously impact the operations of your event or even the overall success of your event. And I think one of the biggest risks that you may face is the loss or shortfall of volunteers. So if you just don't get enough volunteers, what do you do? And we certainly have seen that in a few events where either the volunteer engagement wasn't very good, and so they would have a challenge with volunteer attrition, or where they couldn't deliver on the numbers of volunteers that they needed in different roles, and therefore had to find different solutions. I know not to pick on Rio 2016 again, but that was an event where we had a lot of challenges with the volunteer program. And in terms of getting enough people recruited and committed to turn up to work, and then to keep coming back to work day after day after day, that was a really significant challenge, and it did impact our service levels and our operations to some of our clients. Sometimes volunteers will come with a great set of skills, but maybe they haven't been trained on the specific skills they need for the event. So there may be some competency gaps, and that's something that you may have to work to overcome, whether it be not necessarily teaching them how to do, be an archery official or whatever, but maybe you need to teach them how to do that in that specific event with those parameters that come from, either the event owner or whatever. So sometimes you're dealing with training when you're training people that are already feel like they're competent and ready to go. And so that can be a challenge you need to work through. And then finally, one big risk around the volunteer program is when you have a volunteer workforce, you may have them out there and with some exposure to either getting injured or some other types of liability. And so that's one of the risks that you may need to look at, is how you care for those volunteers when you're putting them out there on the front lines. Okay, let's stop and have a look at some key success factors in your volunteer program that you might be putting together for your event. First, I see the Achilles heel of almost any event organizer is to try to get enough of the right numbers of people in to help support the event. So whether that's at a local event level or all the way up to the Olympic Games, getting enough of the right people with the right talents in is probably the biggest challenge. And so therefore you're going to need to put together programs that will get people interested and excited about the event and want to come help you out. In order to do that, we need to design a program that looks at why people would come and volunteer and help you, and then design all of your business processes or all of your supports to make sure that you're touching those volunteer motivations and really satisfying people for their, for them to get engaged. I think a lot of times I've seen events where not a lot of flexibility is built in to accommodate volunteers, but with volunteers, because you're not paying them, you need to manage them maybe slightly differently, and maybe you need to be a bit more flexible in how they get engaged. And so we'll chat about that in a moment. And finally, it's great if you can find some local partners that are willing to take on the volunteer program or really willing to step up and support you. I know that in my experience in the Olympic Games, oftentimes we go to our marketing partners and they're really thrilled to get involved with the volunteer program and make their staffs available to support as volunteers in their free time. And so those kinds of partnerships, as well as in the community, reaching out to diversity and inclusion type organizations and others that will be very useful in making sure your volunteer program is a success. A few more just to think about. You may want to develop a volunteer strategy, particularly if you're going to be hosting your event more than once or over a sustained period of time, and getting that volunteer strategy supported both at the governance level within your organization and more broadly where necessary, to make sure that it's part of a key element of the event's overall success. As I talked about a few minutes ago, volunteers aren't necessarily free, and so therefore you may need to set aside some budget, and that could be a key success factor for you to think about to take care of all of those volunteers. One area that I think when I've worked with a lot of more mid-size or smaller events is we don't always understand how many people we need and where we need them and when we need them. So I think if you can do a good job with workforce planning, which is really understanding, again, what is a volunteer job, where does that person work, when do they need to turn up on the day, and getting that right so that you're not vastly overstaffed or, not understaffed, that will really help out from an engagement perspective. We'll talk about threats to retaining volunteers in a few minutes, but the biggest one is often that the volunteer doesn't feel like they're making a difference, or that they're bored and don't have enough to do. So you don't necessarily want to overdo it in terms of getting volunteers involved. Okay, and then often if you're going to have a larger workforce to manage, or even a small volunteer workforce to manage, you still want some sort of technology support. Even more nowadays around engagement online and being able to communicate with volunteers in your real-time basis, and sort of creating an online portal or community for them. This doesn't have to be something that you invest, thousands or even millions of dollars in doing, but there probably needs to be some effort around creating that community, that sense of community, and that can just be through social media channels or other ways, but using technology to really help you do that. And then finally, I think you'll want to integrate your volunteer approach across your organization. So if you've got sport trying to do one thing, in your competition area, and you've got maybe some transport volunteers or some hospitality volunteers, just making sure that you have a consistent approach in managing the volunteers across the organization, that will go a long way to making your program a big success. My experience is that whenever volunteers have been treated differently within the same event, you end up with a lot of retention challenges and a lot of complaints. Going all the way back to my first games in Salt Lake 2002, we had some volunteers in one area that were getting an extra pin, or were getting slightly better treatment around food, and that would create all kinds of challenges with all those people who didn't get that. Because you can assume perfect information across the volunteer workforce, and you kind of need to treat everyone at the same level if you can, in my opinion. So I've mentioned a little bit about volunteer motivations, but let's dig into that a little bit more deeply. Back in the end of 1999, actually, so it's been a while, the IOC actually created an international symposium on volunteers, and they've done quite a lot of study around the key motivations for volunteers to work in a major event, particularly the Olympic Games. But I have found through my career that these volunteer motivations are very similar as they've been studied by FIFA World Cup or World Athletics or other organizations, and that there are some unique motivations that bring people to an event, to a sport event. And often those types of motivations might be a little bit different than the volunteers who may come out and support your local school or hospital, or more altruistic kinds of, or charitable kinds of volunteerism. And so I think if you look at these, it's really interesting to understand that these become quite consistent from event to event within this list. And so as you build your volunteer program, you may want to try to study, why would people come to your event? Maybe they are just excited about the event. They have an awareness of the sport. They have a natural affinity then to get engaged. That may be one type of motivation. For others, it may be that they want to develop new skills, or to make new friends, or to, for reasons of national or community pride. Or there are a few volunteers out there that maybe they're there for the stuff and for the experience, to be able to, go and watch a competition or whatever. So, although I'm not necessarily recommending that those volunteers that are interested in that mostly are maybe your best volunteers. Maybe you want to focus on different volunteer motivations. But in line with your event, these are some motivations that you may want to study, and then that might lead to how you design and build your volunteer program. So I just wanted to share a couple of quick examples. These are from Olympic Games. But first with Sochi, before the event started, they went out and tried to research all of the people who might become or might be interested in becoming volunteers to understand why they would come to Sochi 2014. And as you can see, their top motivations tended to be around very social areas. So finding, meeting new people, being a part of the Olympic Games because it was such a big event for Russia, and so as you can see, they studied that, and so when they built their volunteer program, they actually called it socializing or volunteering, which was like going on tour or holiday, but and some of their branding elements to try to address these motivation factors. If you look at Rio, they did this study after they had already found their volunteers, but then they wanted to understand what was motivating them so that they could sustain them through the event. Obviously, there was a lot of personal motivation in Rio if you look at these numbers in terms of people who are quite excited about the Olympic Games and having a personal experience in that. But then you'll also see that there's a lot of interest in the sports. Brazil is a very sport-oriented place, and so there was a high interest in sports. A lot of people interested in the games, but there was also a big focus on building skill sets and trying to use the volunteer experience to improve their career prospects and build on that. So again, I think the opportunity is that you would you can build a program that really fits those expectations or those motivations of the volunteers that might be coming to work for your event. I have one more example I don't have on the slide here, but I worked with the Baku 2015 European Games, and we decided as part of our volunteer vision that we would target university students to work for the European Games as volunteers. And so we knew that we had quite a young group of people that might be interested. And we asked every university student in the country that we could get our hands on, just a quick survey about why would you be interested in coming and working for the European Games. And because we had such a young volunteer population that we were targeting, the most important motivation actually became to develop new skills and to have the volunteer experience be something that they could put on their CV. And so we designed then a very strong training program and tried to showcase and highlight that work experience. And so basically building on that motivation, really trying to deliver a great program that a volunteer would be part of. And get something out of and stay engaged and really work hard through to the end of the event. So I think you can do that even at a more local level or a smaller event, is understanding where your audience is at, what their motivations are, and then again try to address that as much as possible. So let's just take a second and look at, what does a volunteer expect? I think generally speaking, volunteers in all the events I've worked with, they really do want to feel welcome. They do want to feel like they're taken care of a little bit because they are, giving of their time, they are sacrificing to be there for you. They do want to feel valued and, that they are making a difference. Another interesting one that we have found through studying the satisfaction of volunteers in a few events is that often volunteers really want to, they don't want to be nervous about taking on their role. They really want to feel prepared. And so that can be a challenge in the first couple of days that you're operating, where if they maybe aren't stepping up as much as they can, simply because they may not feel fully prepared to take on, whatever task it is that they have to do. And so, that's something to think about. Volunteers, of course, want to feel useful, and they do want to be appreciated. And again, that appreciation, though, might link back to those motivations. But just a genuine, a sincere thank you does go a long way to making your volunteers feel like, they are appreciated, unlike the sign here on the slide that I've seen before. Anyway, okay. So let's go and now take a look at those events delivery steps, the steps in the volunteer journey that I had mentioned earlier. As you can see, we start all the way from, figuring out how many volunteers we need to work on the event, through to finding those volunteers, getting them prepared, and deploying them in the event itself. And just to quickly run through what those look like a little bit. First, we start with, what do we need? I've mentioned that a proper job of kind of planning your volunteer workforce and understanding the head count that is needed and when those people would be deployed and where. It's a pretty important task. One, again, that I feel like in a lot of smaller events maybe gets missed because maybe there's, a lack of understanding or maybe just a lack of available documentation to be able to build proper plans on how many volunteers you need and which skill sets are important. And so this is something that I think that if you get right, that'll help ease your program through the rest of the steps. Obviously, once you've figured out what you need, then you have to go out there and get it. And so looking at it from a sourcing perspective, we really need to get enough candidates through the door that you can, get into roles and get them activated. So in more major events like the Olympic Games or Commonwealth Games, or even, sort of FIFA World Cups, you might target 2 candidates for every job or even more, just to make sure that you have enough of a flow and that you can then be selective from a volunteer perspective. Now, that may not work at the local level, but there could be ways you could generate additional candidates where necessary. And you might have different recruitment strategies to get to those candidates. So I talked a little bit earlier about, maybe if you had a sponsor or marketing partner that you could reach out to, and maybe they would be supportive, or maybe you're working with some schools or your sport federations or clubs. There may be ways to get those organizations involved and supporting the volunteer recruitment process. You may have more of a general social media or general campaign just to get out there and do some recruitment. Even though you may have limited resources to do so, at least you can make yourself available for people who might be interested and engaged in the event. And then you may need to target certain roles for recruitment with specific community groups or members. Specifically, those volunteer jobs that require some more advanced skills. You may not be able to just get those from your general approach, or your just having an application on your website or a Facebook page or whatever. So you may need to look at those really difficult skill sets that you need and figure out where you could possibly source them. And that might be very close partnership with again your sport community, or maybe you are out there knocking on doors of companies, or maybe you're trying to really build a network of people, professionals in those areas, and trying to touch the right people so that you can get, you can generate leads for the recruitment. So you may or may not be, depending on your success of recruitment, able to be too selective, but hopefully there is still some sort of selection process that you're able to apply to your volunteers, and just really trying to screen for the right talents, the right skill sets, and also matching people. So if you don't have an abundance of candidates, at least you're trying to match people into the right roles, based on their skill set, their experience, and their background, as well as where they are indicating to you they want to work. And so a lot of times, it just might be more of a matching. And I know I've worked with several events where you actually might have to do this a couple of times before you settle on who gets what jobs, because you might have to say, oh, this person's really good at this, skill. Perhaps it's a language that you need to, work with athletes, or maybe they've got the right kind of officiating background or something. But at the same time, oh man, they may be great in a different role. So you might, as a new candidate comes in, you might shuffle the decks a little bit and move candidates around. But that selection process, it would be very helpful if you, do structure it in some way so that you can try to kind of maintain the best position for your organizing committee to deploy people in the most efficient way possible, and again, aligned with their skill sets and where you need them most. Some events do have the luxury of being able to say no to volunteers because you have too many volunteer candidates, or maybe that volunteer candidate just feels too entitled or doesn't necessarily fit your event very well. That no message can be quite difficult to deliver in any host community. So you may need to study a little bit how you can say no, to a volunteer, somebody who's saying, well, I will work for you for free. Why are you saying no? So sometimes I found the best way is not just saying no, but no with an alternative. So it's, unfortunately, we can't fit you into the event this time around, but here are some other ways to get involved, or here are some other opportunities out there, or, redirecting volunteers to somewhere that makes sense. Okay, I mentioned kind of if you can have a structured recruitment process. What we have found from working with quite a few Olympic Games and as well as in the Commonwealth Games, that some very similar attributes of volunteers are really useful in terms of finding the right people, and they lend themselves to success. And so this list here, while quite long, you may not try to select people on all of these behaviors, but these are the kinds of behaviors that event organizers tend to value most. Of course, volunteers who are ready to work is at the top of the list there, but attitude is probably the second most important thing. Volunteers who are willing to do anything to support the event, who are just excited and engaged about being there. They're enthusiastic. Obviously, you need volunteers to actually turn up when you ask them to. So being reliable is important as well. So there's the list there. And, again, if you can have a selection process, then you may want to look at ways where you are sorting to those people, whether that's some sort of, interview or some other types of screening, depending on your level of sophistication and how many resources you have available to spend the time on getting the right people into the event. I think one of the challenges we have in selection is, as I've kind of touched on a little bit, is managing expectations. So a volunteer candidate comes to you, they think they should be involved. They don't understand why they have to go through a selection process. In some cultures, I know I'm American, and in the US, we are still able to maintain a really competitive environment for volunteers. That they understand that it's not an automatic thing, that they actually have to apply. But in other cultures, maybe that's not quite so clear. You may, as you move through your selection process, you might still be actively recruiting, even though you've started your selection and started putting people in the right buckets. And so that may create some challenges for you. And I think if you don't have any structured selection process or tools, then you may not be able to assess the volunteers for their commitment. You may not be able to understand how they work and how they would engage working for you during the event. So it's a real challenge, I guess, in some cases, to try to assess that commitment and observe people. And so whatever ways you can do that in terms of creating interaction with volunteer candidates, I think is really useful, and again, lends itself to the success of the program. Okay, so let's assume that you've successfully figured out how many volunteers you needed. You got them through, you recruited them and put them through some sort of selection process, and now you have identified your workforce. Obviously, the next biggest step is getting them trained. And for some events, that may not be too difficult. Maybe it's just, kind of creating a little sense of community and getting some knowledge and information about the event itself. or maybe in other events, you may have a much more green volunteer base, and you may need to do a lot more training to get their skill sets ready to, really have them understand their roles. So in events, even at the local level, I see that you probably have to introduce them to the event, and you need to get them, kind of up to speed on all of the activities that are going to be happening in your venue, and the competition itself, how the schedule works, and all that. And then you may need to spend some time actually training the role, training the tasks that they're going to be working on. Okay, now we've got our volunteers trained and ready to go. For some events, you may have a fairly simple approach to then deploying people. It's a process we call rostering and scheduling, but if you had 500 volunteers over a 10-day event, not every volunteer is going to work every day. If you had a long competition day, let's say you had a morning session and an afternoon session, maybe you're going to switch your volunteers out. You may, depending on how volunteers are available and how much time they can give, you may have to be really creative in how you deploy them. And so this process can be simple if your event is fairly straightforward, or it can be highly complex. And in an Olympic and Paralympic Games, together you may be looking at more than 1 million individual work shifts for your volunteers. And so obviously that's kind of at the maximum level, but even at a smaller event, you still have a lot of complexity or a lot of moving parts potentially. Typically after, you've prepared everybody and you're ready to deploy them, you may have some more processes you need to put them through. Perhaps you're going to accredit everyone or create some sort of badges for your event. And so that credentialing process may take a bit of time. Maybe you have to work with, someone else, the event owner or another part of your organizing committee in terms of getting all those volunteers accredited and ready to go. You may need to outfit your volunteer workforce. In most events, I guess, that I've worked with, even at the more local level, we tend to create some sort of uniform piece to bring the team together and to be able to identify them. I think an important part or principle that I've learned in the uniform program from different events is that we try to really emphasize that the uniform is a work tool rather than a benefit. So it's it's something we kind of need to take seriously. It's something that is the volunteer should see as an implement of their job rather than, oh, I get this because it's a perk. And I think with that kind of expectation being set, then you may have slightly more success and fewer complaints with your uniforms and volunteers' reactions to that, particularly if you have a very limited budget and maybe you're only, providing T-shirts or whatever. So again, kind of repositioning that uniform as a necessary component of the job rather than part of your, your retention program. On the other hand, it is a great benefit, and it can create a real sense of team and exclusivity for the volunteers, because maybe they're the only ones with the uniforms, or maybe it's really something they can be very proud of when they are wearing them. So I mean, it's got both sides, so there is some opportunity around that as well. For your volunteer workforce, if you have long days, if you've got transport requirements, if you've got different services that need to be delivered to them, then there is some work to do around that. So maybe if you're a slightly larger event, you're going to have a single point of contact or some sort of contact center, whether that's somebody answering the phone or managing the social media channels or whatever. And so that may require some resource. You may also need to arrange some other services, including, again, are you going to feed the volunteers during their shifts? You need to provide parking for them or some sort of public transport or whatever those additional services that may be required. And so there's some work to do around that, but I think it's useful to get an early start on some of this so that you can communicate expectations, again, starting at the recruitment stage, so that volunteers know what they're getting into when they are giving of their time, here are the other parameters of that. And I've seen successful volunteer programs where they don't provide meals or they don't provide transport or whatever. And so I don't think that you should be scared by that. It's just around getting the expectations properly set and then delivering hopefully at those levels, at those expectations, or maybe a little bit above them. In terms of day-to-day management, so once you're in your event, the volunteers are going to still need some support. And whether that's, whether they're checking in with you each day or they're checking in with their supervisor, but, just making sure that when they arrive on venue, that they're being managed well, and most importantly, that they're being welcomed and thanked for their contributions, and just engaged so that they understand that they are a valued part of that team. This could look, again, quite simple, or if you're in the Olympic Games or a FIFA World Cup, it could be quite an extensive check-in process, including, in current days, even maybe health checks or other activities to get the volunteers ready to go for their shift. Okay, so while you're there on venue, there may be all kinds of fun things you can do, some of which cost zero money or very little money. But to motivate people and to retain them through to the end of the event. And as I've talked about, really understanding what those motivations are can go a long way to helping you build this program and to invest, very small resources in that success. So if your volunteers were primarily there because they wanted to, be part of a team or make new friends, then you can, create those opportunities as part of the volunteer program on a daily basis, and really help people, build those friendships and build those relationships for a lifetime. So those are some opportunities that you have. And again, even with limited budgets, I think that you can create, or you can engage the volunteers in their own motivation and retention. I've seen that done very successfully, where there's a small amount of money to spend, or even it's just bring your own creativity from home, and people get involved and really kind of create a community, even in a short event that's only running a few days. So I think there's some real opportunity there. So we've covered all of those steps, but just again around that motivation and leveraging people during the event, we need to make sure that those people those volunteers stay engaged and retained. And some of the key threats to that retention are very similar to some of those key success factors I've already talked about. So if we really need volunteers to feel like they make a difference, that they are being used, that they aren't bored, that's probably the biggest one that I've seen in terms of keeping people turning up day after day. We see that communication challenges can really cause the difference between a happy workforce and an unhappy workforce. And so just that daily communication, that daily interaction, welcomes and thank yous and things like that make a big difference. Sometimes volunteers, if it's too hard to get to the event, they won't turn up. That's certainly true even in the Olympic Games. If it takes two hours to get there, and 3 different kinds of transport modes, then they may not get there. And so you can understand where these pressure points are, where these threats are to your retention. You may need to make some adjustments in your plans in order to make sure that you can address these. And there are some others as well, but making sure that people, again, are feeling welcomed, and that they feel like they're making a difference, and that they're being used well, and that they're prepared for the roles. Those are the key threats that I think that you may need to address as you build your volunteer program for your event. Just a couple of other thoughts around reward and recognition programs. I've seen all kinds of activities that have been done, again, that don't necessarily cost a lot of money, but in terms of communications, creating that kind of team environment or that exclusive volunteer program feeling, that might be through newsletter, that might be through social media. If there's some way that people can take pride in associating themselves with your event, whether that's a certificate or you know, whatever that way is, that basically that you're creating this opportunity for them to feel like they've made a difference, and they can broadcast and celebrate that difference that they made through, you know, whatever mechanisms you have, whether it be certificates or otherwise. You may have, if you're running an event, maybe a lot of your volunteers are actually interested in the sport, and so creating opportunities for them to either get tickets or to watch the sport can be an exciting way to reward them. And then there may be things that you come across through fundraising or your sponsors or partners, you know, just stuff that you can get into the program, prizes that you can go for, silly games, you know, and other types of celebrations that you might be able to have a look at and build into your program. If you have an event that maybe you're going to host on a regular basis every year, every couple of years, you may be able to create some sort of long-term recognition opportunities, and those can be really powerful. I know with it's not a sport event, but some work that I've done with the Sundance Film Festival here in Utah. They have, you know, 85–90% of their volunteers come back every year, and that's because they have this kind of great recognition program, and they feel like it's a, you know, it's a really good opportunity to be involved. And so with all of these things together, they continue to get, you know, they have a fairly easy time recruiting volunteers each year. Okay, so let's bring this all together, what we've covered over the last few minutes. First of all, volunteers create the environment for success. So, oh, sorry, let me start that over. Hang on one second.
No worries. Good. I really like it. Very interesting.
Is it okay? I just feel like I'm just powering through it, so I don't know. Yeah.
Oh, it's really cool. It's really cool.
Okay. All right. Let's see. Okay. So, all right. Let's bring together everything that we've discussed over the last few minutes. First, around the volunteer program, we need to create an environment for success. So I recommend that if you can, try to study and understand the motivations of your volunteers and design that program that meets those needs and their motivations. And if you do that, that will really, I think, prepare you for a very successful volunteer program and a very successful event. If you can make your event a positive one that people want to spend time in, you know, and that doesn't have to be because the event itself, you know, has the most elite athletes or the biggest, you know, budget for, you know, for event presentation or whatever, but just creating the environment that's a positive one, again, will make the difference for the volunteer. And that's really what my experience is, that most of them are there because of the relationships, because they may have, you know, reasons that they're getting involved, and they may have to do with the sport, but they're not always just about the sport. I think if you can, through your volunteer program, answer that question, do I matter? Do I make a difference? That at the very individual level can really be a powerful way of having that volunteer get all the way through your event and again, have a lot of satisfaction. And I think from a legacy perspective in your community or with your sport, wherever possible, if you can give a person a chance to grow, as you know, through their volunteer experience. So whether that's them picking up a new skill or, you know, feeling like they've become a better person somehow, that's a really powerful way to get your volunteers engaged, and again, have them be ambassadors for you and stay engaged over the long term. We didn't spend a lot of time on this in the presentation, but we did talk about communications and relationship building, and the way that you often need to do that in a smaller event is through your, you know, your supervisors or the line managers, whoever is directly managing those volunteers on a day-to-day basis. Make sure that those individuals have been trained on how to manage volunteers in an event environment, and make sure that they're really energizing the volunteers every day, so that they are there and making a difference and providing that, you know, sincere praise and, you know, that those thank yous for the volunteers and their involvement. And that kind of relationship will really make the difference. I think the world of volunteering is changing a little bit and will continue to, I think, evolve over the next years in the event space. And here are a few of my own personal observations, excuse me. I think that volunteering is becoming even more and more important to an event being viable as we, need to squeeze budgets, or we need to get more creative on how to deliver an event. And with the number of events out there, there's really, not a lot of other solutions to bringing, the right kind of human capital into an event. And so volunteering really becomes that solution. So if anything, we probably need to be spending more time on developing a volunteer program and building relationships with volunteers and the community than we would have in the past in order to make this successful. And the other thing is, I think as people, as generations change and we need to start involving more people and younger people in the volunteer programs, I think that we need to be also very creative in how we look at the volunteer work itself. And so, as we create the volunteer jobs and what volunteers can do, I think that we may need to be quite flexible in how we approach volunteer roles and defining who does what. And maybe, we need to be better at job sharing, or we need to be better at training our volunteers to have multiple skill sets so that they could work in different jobs, maybe a morning shift in one role and an afternoon shift in a different role, or whatever the case may be. But essentially, we need to be working on getting our volunteer workforce to be more flexible to support that event as we continue to have pressures on, financial viability and all of those kinds of things. So those are a few thoughts there. I don't know exactly how that all shakes out yet, but I'm excited to observe that and work on that with all the events that I get to work with on an ongoing basis. So I hope this has been helpful, and it's sure been fun for me to share my experience with the volunteer programs with you. And hopefully we'll have a chance to confer further on this.